I'm Alex Hillman. I'm a qualitative researcher on the ideal study. So that means I go and speak to people in a more conversational format about what it's like to live with dementia, and also speak to those people who are living with and supporting those living with dementia. Often we describe, as researchers, we describe qualitative interviewing as a form of guided conversation. So I suppose I'm coming at this about how we can encourage having conversations with people living with dementia from a kind of research perspective on the one hand, but I think there's lots of synergies really for everyone about how they feel about talking to people living with dementia, perhaps some of the fears and anxieties people may have, and then hopefully some of the positive experiences of the things, the worthwhile experiences that you can have by having those conversations, and some maybe tips and strategies about how you might think about them and approach them in a kind of positive way for you both. So that's where I'm coming from, and I'm looking forward to chatting with Monica to hear more about what she has to say.
I'm Monica. I live in the southeast, and I'm just recently retiring from being an accounts administrator. I live in a village, and there's 2 villages here, and we run a group for the older people of the community. We meet on the first Thursday of the month in a pub, which the ladies love because normally they wouldn't be going into a pub, but they feel quite safe coming into a pub. And we meet there for coffee. And then we do singing for fun on the second Thursday of the month as well in the village hall. And we're very fortunate we got 2 professional musicians who are delighted to come along and share their music voluntarily with people of these 2 groups. It's all voluntary, and another person and I, we run the group. So it does take quite a lot of time, but the great reward is the fantastic seeing them laugh and seeing them have a good time. And as I say, we're totally inclusive. So we've got people with Parkinson's and dementia and other medical problems as well. So all that set aside, and we just have a good time getting together. So not only that, I had an aunt with dementia, and rather unusually, she lived in Cyprus. And that was a very different challenge to a lot of challenges people have. And eventually I was able to repatriate her. And then in the village through the group, I have found that there's been several people with dementia. I particularly looked after one lady in the village and became her carer. And I always point out, never a living carer, but I became her carer for all her needs and everything else, because her daughter lived in Canada. We then had another gentleman. He attended the groups with his wife. There was a gentleman, his wife asked me to support him because she was unfortunately taken ill. He had frontal temporal lobe dementia, and he wasn't able to communicate, but he loved walking. So I would take him all the way around the village, and for as long as possible to give his wife a break. We then had our friend, a joint friend, my husband and I, who lived in the village. He had a lot of medical problems. And I would say about 18 months ago, we realized he had a memory problem. We could see it was getting worse, but the family didn't seem to accept this. And I said, I really feel you need to go to the doctors. Would you like me to make an appointment for you? So he was sitting by the side of me. I phoned up the doctors. They asked if he was sitting there to give his permission for me to speak with them at the doctors to make this appointment. And he agreed. And I asked for a 20-minute appointment because obviously it takes longer to go through things sometimes with people to really explain the problem. And he had his 20-minute appointment. And then he was diagnosed with a memory problem and then got forwarded on to memory clinics. And I think the family then accepted there were more problems. And he enjoyed coming to speak to me about it. And one thing I particularly stressed was he said, oh, my memory gets worse. And I said, look, just explain to people you've got a memory problem. And if they know you've got a memory problem, they might actually realize that you can't remember their name, and they might then give you their name and help you a little bit with the conversation. So we used to have lovely conversations about, you know, problems he was finding. We got him the Alzheimer's clock and with dates and things like that on, and gradually found things that would help him as well.
One of the things you said there about people reminding the person with dementia about their name, one of the things that I have learned to do in a research context, but I think it would help anyone, is just little ways you can feed that into the conversation to kind of just remind people of the context of who you are, why you're having that conversation, in a way that doesn't feel like you're doing that, but it's just fed in, you know. So often I would sort of frame a question of being like, well, you know, as researchers, we're really interested in your experience of that situation. And obviously with me coming from the Ideal team, you know, just so that it's a natural way of feeding it in, but it brings them back to the context of that conversation in a way that kind of, yeah, that they can kind of ground what's happening, who you are, you know, and orientate them again. I think that's something that everyone could do actually a little bit, just to kind of give people that extra little bit of support so that they are reminded of, yeah, the context of how they know that person. Or
yes, I found that quite useful, because we've got another person who's recently been diagnosed with dementia, and he says exactly the same. And I say exactly the same words. Don't be afraid to say you've got a memory problem, and names always seem to go first, don't they? And so and it's quite interesting, because his wife wants to speak to me about it. So I think if other people do find there have been carers or carers with somebody with dementia, to try and talk to each other about it as well. There's no two cases are ever the same, as I discovered in the number of people that I have dealt with. They're all individuals and they're all lovely people, and it's still necessary to go out and do things and be as active as possible. And we do encourage them all, and we arrange lifts and things like that for them to be able to join in.
I think that's so important. It's about adapting it, isn't it, in a way, still doing those things, but thinking about ways you can adapt it to make it possible and to make it enjoyable for people. And that's so true what you're saying about everybody's different, because when I was thinking about this conversation, I was thinking about some things that have helped in particularly challenging interviews, or where I'm having conversations with people where we're struggling, and it would be very different for different people. And I think one thing is that I've found really helpful is sometimes using things around people, physical objects, things like photo albums, or if somebody's really into sport, they might have you know, some kind of sporting memorabilia, or something around that person that you might be able to say, oh, I see you have, you know, are you interested in that football team, or can you tell me more about, or who's that in that picture? But that may be awful for somebody else for whom faces and names are starting to become less clear. So it's finding the right thing for the right person. But I think sometimes those kind of objects that ground people in some way, for some people I spoke to, they were really into crafts and creating things, and talking to them about that, you know, I see you're into your knitting, what pattern are you following at the moment, you know, that kind of thing. If you're really drying up on the conversation, can really get things going again, because it's something tangible that they can describe how they're doing it or what they're doing. But those are, as exactly as you say, they're really specific to each individual person. And the other thing I think to pick up on in what you said there as well is about using those people that are closest to them. So if you do have an uncle or an aunt that maybe you don't see so often, you know, have a conversation with their husband or wife or son or daughter about how they are at the moment, you know, what things they're enjoying, you know, what kind of is the best time to talk to them, even those practical things, so that, you know, you're a bit more prepared when you sort of speak to them, you know, the kinds of things to ask them about and perhaps what to avoid. And that's equally true to say, I think, of professionals, you know, carers who are working with people with dementia, to have those conversations with their main carer to get a bit more insight.
I also feel that it's so important to say that dementia is, you're on a journey, because in the journey, you're starting at the beginning of the journey, and the journey changes as you go through. And I think people often find it quite difficult to accept the changes.
Yeah.
But then different support is needed at different times of the journey as well.
Absolutely.
Sometimes, you know, if somebody was able to do something and then gradually over a period of time they can't, they find that difficult to accept, but then you have to, as you say, lock into the next part to see what they can do in this part, and invariably they can go back in their younger days. I'd invariably find that people can go back quite a time. We've got a few have been in the war, and they can still talk about that and their tank driving and different things that they were doing. They've told us what's going on in the village, and we actually did in our parish magazine some articles of what their reflections on their war years.
Oh, lovely.
It's quite interesting to do. And the other thing in COVID is we were quite concerned about them, and so we set up a telephone system, and we had 6 helpers phoning 6 to 8 people every Monday morning, and it was amazing how the telephone calls over the weeks were getting longer and longer and longer because we then were finding out more about the people, we were chatting more, and how was the family, and generally having chats. So I think if people aren't able to get out quite so much, that particularly for carers, to find people they can phone and have a chat with and link in with, really.
I think that's so true though as well, about you saying how the conversations got longer and longer. And I think that's another thing to say if you're talking about encouraging people to reach out and have those conversations, is that the first steps might be a little bit tentative and a little bit challenging, but the more you do it, the more you'll get used to how that person is, and things will get easier, and you'll start to have those more, you start to get to know, exactly as you say, about their family, more about the things that they spark from. And so the more you do it, the more you can get from it, and the more that you can kind of feel those fears start to drift away, and you start to think, actually, I don't know why I was worried about this,
And it also gives the carers, if they've had a conversation, they can, say to the person, oh, well, I was speaking, whoever it was, and, have a little bit more to chat about as well.
I'm wondering how they found the telephone conversations, because one of the things I was thinking about, because I've recently just done some follow-up interviews with people, obviously over the phone this time, whereas previously they were face-to-face. And I noticed just how much those non-verbal cues are, just the kind of smiling, nodding, those reassurances that you are engaged, you're listening, particularly if there are any little gaps, because one thing I found was that I was doing a lot more kind of reassuring noises on the phone of, yes, I see, filling those gaps, because if there were gaps, I found that people were quite anxious, am I saying the right thing, or am I making sense? Is that okay? So I was doing a lot more of that reassurance. And I guess that is something to think about a bit as well, of the differences if you're having a conversation over the phone. So if you're seeing somebody face to face, because I think there's definitely a lot to be said about the atmosphere you create is almost as important, I think, as what you talk about or what you say. So just smiling, showing that you're engaged and you're listening, you're interested in what they have to say, is almost as important, I think. One thing that really stuck with me really early on in my journey of kind of working with people living with dementia was that moods and feelings linger. And so how you're left feeling after a conversation is almost more important than what you've talked about. So if you go away feeling positive, then that may stay with you for the rest of that day. But if you go away with a kind of uncomfortable feeling or an anxious feeling, that can equally stay with you. So that really stuck with me, actually. And I think that that's probably true to say of us all to an extent, but I think even more so for people living with dementia. And I think that's part of the fear people have about what am I going to say? How am I going to make sure that the conversation keeps running? Well, actually just showing that you're there, you're interested, you care is almost as important, if not more, than the things that you actually talk about.
Also, it's reflecting on your own mind. I've just done a hospital visit with somebody, and they're not very communicative. But then on certain things, I could reflect on my childhood, and I was saying, oh yes, certain topics I knew would be quite interesting, and they were smiling, because it's not always what they can reflect on, but sometimes what you can reflect on that might bring a smile to their face about, anything and everything, really. And yeah. I thought that was quite important. And I think one thing important is my aunt from Cyprus became, she couldn't communicate at all and couldn't communicate for some time. And I went to sit with her one afternoon. She had carers, and the carers always tried to give them time off. So I sat with her one afternoon, and there she was, not able to talk. And she came out with the clearest sentence in English. She was an English teacher originally. And people think that if they're not able to talk, that they can't think. And I think that's one thing I've always referred to people saying, but in my aunt's case, she wasn't able to speak for some length of time. Yet she came out with this really, really clear sentence. She knew what had been going on over the last few months or year. Yeah. That's something that is so important for people to know, that they might not think they're making a difference. So the kind word here to the person, whatever it may be, I think it is there, but sometimes they find it difficult to show, don't they?
Mm. Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the things as well that I started to pick up on the more I spoke to people, particularly who perhaps were more advanced, was that sometimes it wasn't so much the literal sense of what people were saying, but perhaps a feeling it was conveying, that it might actually just, like, if somebody was anxious about finding something or what time it was, it was probably just a general feeling of maybe feeling a little bit anxious or uncomfortable. So that perhaps all they needed was a bit of a break or a bit of reassurance. And it wasn't necessarily that they were really literally worried about what the exact time was or finding that object. It was just a general sense of how they were feeling.
And they do need good support from their local services as well. And I think it's so important that they do pursue it, that they tap into their local resources. And there can be times as the dementia progresses that it can become very, very challenging. But I do try to say to people, it's not the person who wouldn't normally be like this, but it is the dementia that's affecting them. And I think that's so important for people to realise that sometimes people change quite a bit in their ideas and thoughts and things like that. But it is the dementia that's changing them. And I think sometimes if you're not careful, that friends and people can go in the opposite direction rather than support you. And I think it's so important that you try to encourage family and friends to realise that, particularly a carer, you need support. And, this is where we are at the moment, and that they, do mix in with people.
I think even before as well, it gets to those, as you say, those really challenging times where things do get more advanced and you need more support. I think even earlier on, I think it's family and friends accepting that maybe those conversations, be open to those conversations being different to how they were before, and maybe approaching them differently, but recognizing that maybe just because they're different, there's still the possibility for laughs or for sharing music together, or there's still opportunities to have something meaningful in those conversations, but it just may be different, or it may have changed from how those conversations were in the past. But to kind of be a bit more accepting and open to that, because good things can come from that, I think.
Talk to somebody who might have dealt with somebody who got dementia, to see probably the best way to speak to the person. And when they actually meet the person, just see where they are, what they would like to do, what they'd like to talk about, and what their thoughts are, what they want to do, what their bucket list is, what they would like to do.
Yeah, I would really echo that. I think don't be afraid about doing or saying the wrong thing, because the most important thing is going in open, showing that you're interested and that you care. That's a massive contribution in and of itself, and take the lead from them. Find the spark of the thing that interests them, and not to worry if things do happen, to sit and support someone if they get tearful, or to laugh with someone. Those things are normal human emotions, and not to be afraid of those things either.